Immanuel Kant. The name itself, it often conjures these images of just weighty tomes and intricate logical structures and philosophy so dense it can feel almost impenetrable. Yet, when you actually look at the man who produced all this monumental work, the contrast between the life and the thought is almost startling.
It truly is. I mean, here is a philosopher born in 1724 who lived through some of the most dramatically transformative periods in modern history. We're talking the Seven Years' War, the Enlightenment, American independence, the French Revolution, and he never once, not once, left the immediate vicinity of his native province of Königsberg.
Right. He lived what was famously described as a mechanically ordered, abstract, old bachelor kind of existence.
Yeah.
You hear these wonderful, almost mythical stories about the precise timing of his daily walks, so regular that his neighbors could literally set their clocks by him.
And that meticulous, almost sterile outward life stands in such a direct contrast to the incredible upheaval he caused in the world of ideas. I always love how the poet Heine captured this. He noted the strange contrast between that hyper-regularized life and his destructive, world-smashing thoughts.
It's like the quietest, most predictable man in the quietest German town housed this philosophical earthquake that just completely remade modern thought.
It did. And that earthquake wasn't an impulse. It was the result of incredibly patient study. I mean, half a lifetime of systematic work.
And that's our mission for this deep dive. We want to systematically unpack the core principles of his philosophical system. We're going into the structure of his mind, primarily contained within his three great works, the critiques. The critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason, and of course the critique of judgment.
We're really trying to provide that shortcut to being well-informed, diving into what Kant actually means and, why his work is so foundational. He is often, and rightly, framed as the first philosopher who truly forced modern science, the science of Descartes and Galileo, to become conscious of its own methods and, crucially, its own limits.
And the absolute starting point for this entire project, the mechanism by which Kant conducted this massive philosophical self-inventory, is what he termed criticism.
Yes, and we need to clarify that term immediately because it's not what we think of today. It's absolutely not meant in the modern negative sense of just finding fault or being petty.
Right, it's not about complaining.
No. For Kant, criticism was a systematic method of taking stock. You should imagine it as a comprehensive survey, a philosophical audit, if you will. It was designed to estimate the achievements, define the scope, and deal with the conflicting, often chaotic claims that had emerged in Western thought after the Renaissance and the Reformation.
So after centuries where thinkers had gone off in a million brilliant but often contradictory directions, you have this period of profound success but also profound intellectual burnout. Kant realized the first step wasn't building a new system. It was charting the terrain that was already there.
Exactly. Where did reason succeed, and where did it fatally overreach?
He saw criticism as this essential, necessary middle ground, steering philosophy away from two opposing pitfalls.
Precisely. On one side, you had dogmatism, this overconfident assertion fueled by the rationalists, that reason could prove everything about reality without ever checking its own limitations. And on the other side, you had skepticism, the complete exhaustion that follows, the despair that reason couldn't prove anything at all, which was spurred on by the empiricists.
So dogmatism leads to arrogance, skepticism leads to paralysis, and Kant's criticism is the attempt to find the legitimate boundaries of rational thought.
And this necessity for self-examination, this demanding survey of the mind's own power, was Kant's great philosophical discovery. Why was it so necessary at that particular moment? Well, because thought had experienced this great, steady, verifiable success in some areas, most notably mathematical physics, the whole Newtonian revolution, but that success stood in sharp contrast to absolute failure and contradiction in others, like morals, theology, and traditional metaphysics.
Right. The very methods that allowed us to precisely predict planetary motion seemed entirely incapable of producing any certainty about the nature of God or the freedom of the soul. That dissonance, it just couldn't be ignored.
It had led to a crisis of confidence in philosophy itself. I mean, when the methods of thought produce perfect clarity in one area and complete confusion in another, you have to stop and ask, is there something wrong with the methods? Or is there something wrong with the objects we are applying those methods to?
That brings us directly into the intellectual breakdown that really required Kant's intervention, that famous conflict between the great schools of thought.
The 17th and 18th centuries were defined by this enormous tension, a conceptual tug-of-war that ultimately led to what Kant observed as a state of weariness and complete indifferentism in philosophy.
People just gave up.
They did. They simply stopped caring about metaphysics because it seemed incapable of producing anything certain.
And as you mentioned, you had two colossal movements pulling in opposite directions. First, the movement known as rationalism, which Kant often labeled as dogmatism, rooted in thinkers like Descartes and Leibniz. So what was their fundamental belief about knowledge?
They believed that truly scientific knowledge must be capable of universal mathematical expression. They operated under the assumption that reality itself was fundamentally mathematical in its structure. The ideal for them was to deduce all truths about the universe from a few central, clearly conceived axioms, just like you deduce geometric proofs.
So the messy sensory world of color and smell, our ordinary perception, they just viewed that as confused thinking. It was imprecise.
Exactly. The rationalist hope was that scientific progress, moving through deductive reasoning, would eventually remove our dependence on messy observation altogether. Deduction, certainty, mathematics, that was the gold standard.
But then you have the other side, empiricism, championed by Locke, Berkeley, and most crucially for our story, David Hume. And they insisted that all knowledge comes primarily from observation and experiment.
Right. And John Locke, reacting to those dogmatic excesses, he recognized the need for a philosophical audit, the very criticism we just discussed. He wanted to examine our own abilities to see what the human understanding was fitted to deal with.
But this is where Kant saw Locke taking a wrong course.
A completely wrong course. Locke treated this inquiry as a plain historical inquiry. He thought knowledge was just looking at what is present to the mind, as if you were opening a closet door in your consciousness and just cataloging the furniture inside. Knowledge was just having an idea in your head.
And this purely passive observational approach, even though it has this common sense appeal, it immediately runs into serious problems when you put it up against the one great success story of the era, mathematical science, particularly Newtonian astronomy.
The Lockean model failed on two critical counts. First, it couldn't explain universality. If knowledge comes only from individual perceptions, how can you move from, I observed this piece of gold melting, to the universal necessary statement? All gold melts at this temperature. You can't observe all the gold in the universe.
And second, it failed to account for the synthesis involved in mathematics. I mean, geometry isn't just about unpacking the definition of a triangle. It involves discovering new properties, like the sum of the angles being 180 degrees, by connecting two previously separate ideas. That's a new piece of information. That's synthesis.
And astronomy was the perfect paradox. It was successful, so it had to have necessary a priori relations mathematical laws. But it also required specific, contingent, empirical observation. The mere fact about where a planet was in space at a certain time. So it defied both the rationalists' purely deductive ideal and the empiricists' purely observational model at the same time.
So the very foundation of science seemed to rely on a type of knowledge that neither of the major philosophical schools could actually justify. This is what sets the stage for David Hume, the intellectual shockwave that woke Kant from what he famously called his dogmatic slumber.
Hume was the most ruthless and thoroughgoing empiricist. He took Locke's premises, that all concrete knowledge comes from experience and observation, and he followed them to their chilling, logical conclusion. He reasoned that if all our knowledge of concrete existence relies on the fundamental principle of causation, then that principle must itself be justified empirically.
And his famous conclusion was that it couldn't be. You couldn't justify causation by either reason or observation. Why did he reach this radical... I mean, it seems to defy common sense, this conclusion.
Well, because he analyzed what we actually perceive. He made the radical observation that when we talk about cause and effect, say a billiard ball hitting another, we do not observe the necessary link, the causal power between A and B.
You just see one thing, then the next.
That's it. We only observe A and then B in constant succession. We see the movement, then the impact, then the second movement. The necessary force linking them is invisible. It is not a sensory input.
So it's not something we can see or touch.
Exactly. And the rationalists had no answer for this because they couldn't deduce the necessary link mathematically. So Hume was left with the conclusion that the necessity we attribute to causation, that absolute belief that A must lead to B, isn't in the external things themselves. It's just a subjective internal feeling or anticipation that results purely from custom or habit.
In other words, we expect the sun to rise tomorrow just because it always has, not because we understand some rational mechanism that requires it to.
Precisely. And this was devastating. It meant that the mind was reduced to a purely passive observer, only capable of associating ideas based on habit? If cause is just the passive effect of custom, then the very idea of scientific inquiry, which actively seeks universal principles, that's destroyed. Genuine empirical science, as we know it, becomes impossible. This was the moment of crisis.
And Kant saw this destruction, this skepticism, but he also saw the successful reality of Newtonian physics. So he agreed with Hume. We don't get the principle of causation from experience. But he disagreed with the conclusion that it was, therefore, just subjective custom. He recognized that we do need that principle to even start doing science.
This double failure rationalism, failing to account for empirical fact, empiricism failing to account for universal principles, created the twofold task of the critical philosophy. Kant had to, 1, explain and justify the methods of science, which clearly work, and 2, he had to find a standard to mediate the conflicting claims between science and religion or morality, which both dogmatism and empiricism had failed to do.
And to solve this huge, sprawling historical mess, Kant distilled it all down into one single, laser-focused question.
Kant's intellectual genius is right here. He takes that broad, messy historical crisis and crystallizes it into one specific, seemingly abstract, logical question. How are synthetic a priori judgments possible?
And that phrase is the intellectual key to the entire critique of pure reason. If you can really articulate what Kant means by that sentence, you understand the engine that's driving his entire theoretical philosophy. So let's break down the definitions slowly so you can use this phrase as your own shortcut.
Okay, we need to understand two fundamental distinctions about knowledge. First, the structure of the judgment itself. Analytic versus synthetic.
Right. Analytic knowledge is just what it sounds like. It's knowledge gained by analysis. You're simply unraveling what is already contained in the definition of the subject. The classic example is, all bachelors are unmarried. The predicate, unmarried, is already part of the concept of the subject, bachelor. It doesn't give you any new information.
Correct. It's certain, but it's not really discovery. Synthetic knowledge, on the other hand, is a synthesis. It's putting together separate ideas or concepts, and by doing that, discovering a genuinely new truth. When you say, this shirt is blue, the concept of blue is not contained in the definition of shirt. You've connected two separate ideas based on your experience.
And this distinction is so crucial for philosophy. If all knowledge were just analytic, we would be trapped in tautologies, just repeating ourselves.
Exactly. Now, the second distinction is about the source of the knowledge. A priori versus a posteriori.
A posteriori knowledge is contingent. It's derived from sense experience, from observation. You can only verify it after the fact. It is cold eyesight today. That's true for now, but not necessarily tomorrow.
And a priori knowledge is necessary, certain, and universally valid, independent of any specific experience. 2 + 2 = 4. That truth holds regardless of what happens outside your window.
So traditionally, before Kant, most philosophers agreed on two types of valid knowledge. You had the analytic a priori tautological definitions, pure logic, which the rationalists loved, and you had synthetic a posteriori empirical observations, facts from experiments, which the empiricists loved.
And the crisis arose because Hume demonstrated that the very foundation of successful human knowledge, the principle of causation and mathematical science, seemed to belong to a third, previously unrecognized category, the synthetic a priori.
Okay, let's go back to causation. Why is the statement, every event has a cause, a synthetic judgment?
It's synthetic because the concept of the effect is not contained in the concept of the cause. If I see a match strike, I do not analytically deduce fire. The cause, which is striking, and the effect, fire, are two separate concepts that experience forces me to connect. It's a genuine connection, a synthesis.
Okay, that makes sense. But why is it a priori? This is the key argument against Hume.
It's a priori because it's universal and necessary. We don't wait for experience to tell us that events might have a cause. We assume this principle before we even look for specific causal laws. We use it to guide and structure our experience. If a scientist sees an anomaly, they don't say, well, perhaps this event had no cause. They say, I must search harder for the cause. The principle is a condition for the possibility of rational investigation.
So if this kind of judgment exists, and Kant is certain it does in geometry and physics, then we have to understand where it comes from. Otherwise, the whole edifice of science collapses into just Humean custom. The validity of these principles, the certainty of the synthetic a priori, is the condition that makes all empirical knowledge possible.
Absolutely. Kant is arguing that these principles are not statements about the ultimate nature of reality, but they are the necessary conditions that the human mind imposes on raw sensation in order to understand objects at all. And if we can understand the source of these conditions, then we can define the limits of our reason.
This is the critical turning point. He's saying that instead of the mind passively conforming to objects, the objects must conform to the structure of the mind. And this leads directly to his famous Copernican turn.
That's the perfect way to frame it. The Copernican change in philosophy. I mean, Copernicus showed that the heavens revolved around the sun, not the observer. Kant proposes a similar shift in how we think about knowledge. Reason does not merely passively observe objects as they really exist. Instead, objective experience is only possible because the objects, as they appear to us, must conform to the necessary structure imposed by our understanding.
And this introduces his famous distinction: things in themselves, the noumenon, which is reality independent of our perception, and phenomena, which are things as they appear to us, structured and conditioned by our own cognitive apparatus. We are strictly limited to knowing only the phenomenal world.
Now, here we have to be extremely careful, because this can sound a lot like the subjective idealism that Kant was actively trying to escape. Many people before him, like Berkeley, argued that we only know ideas inside the brain, and the external world is just some kind of persistent illusion. Kant rigorously refutes this.
Why is Kant's transcendental idealism so different from Berkeley's version?
Because Berkeley's idealism leads to absurdity. I mean, if we only know internal ideas, how did we get the concept of externality in the first place? Kant insists that the very basis of our simplest experience implies externality. We are conscious of ourselves only in the act of knowing something external to us. So the question of whether objects exist outside or inside the brain is, for Kant, entirely and absolutely irrelevant to his core project.
His project isn't about the location of the object, but about the rules that govern our knowledge of it.
Precisely. His goal is to explain how we can anticipate experience by establishing universal laws. His limiting claim that all knowledge is conditioned rests on the fact that all knowledge, even the highest level of thought, ultimately depends on sensory input, on perception, as he says. This is possible only when the object is given. We are finite minds, and our knowledge is necessarily limited by the conditions of our specific ways of perceiving.
This brings us to the first section of the critique of pure reason, the transcendental aesthetic, which analyzes the foundational structures of perception. And here he argues that space and time are not external things we observe. Instead, they are the essential inherent framework supplied by the mind itself. They are the a priori forms of our perception.
To really get this, you have to look at the competing views Kant rejected. First, you have Isaac Newton, who saw space and time as absolute realities, existing independently of all things, like two separate, infinite containers.
So that makes them sound like these giant empty voids that would exist even if the universe was completely empty?
And Kant finds that incoherent. He calls them two eternal, infinite, and self-subsisting non-realities. If space is just the arrangement of things, then space without things is meaningless to us. Then you have Leibniz, the rationalist, who thought that space and time were merely relations that we derive from comparing objects. They were abstract concepts, secondary to the objects themselves.
Kind of like abstracting the idea of heaviness after observing a lot of heavy objects.
Yes. But Kant argued this also fails because the perception of space and time is required before we can perceive and compare individual things. You can't even perceive two things without already presupposing they exist outside one another in space, or experience change without presupposing it happens successively in time. They're a priori. They structure the experience from the get-go.
So space, which structures external perception, and time, which structures internal perception, are the necessary lenses. They are the fixed framework that arranges the raw sensory material, what he calls the manifold of the phenomenon, into specific ordered relations that we can then understand.
This is why he draws the final, crucial distinction here. Space and time are empirically real. They are constants in what we perceive. Everything we experience is necessarily spatial and temporal, but they are transcendentally ideal. We only run into contradictions and philosophical illusions when we try to treat them as independent, ultimate realities existing outside our perception, like when we debate the nature of infinite space.
And this resolves some of those famous paradoxes, like the infinite divisibility of space.
Exactly. The infinite divisibility and infinite extension are not qualities of existing things in themselves. They are qualities of the absolute framework we construct to order our finite perceptions. When we measure something, we use an infinitely divisible spatial determination, but that quality belongs to the organizing form, not the matter being organized.
So this first step, the aesthetic, is a limiting move. We only know things as they appear, structured by these necessary forms of perception. This framework gives us the a priori principles needed for mathematics, since geometry relies on the a priori certainty of space. But to go beyond mere perception to objective knowledge, we need to actively think. We need the understanding.
And now we shift from the mind's receptivity, the passive way sensory data is taken in and structured in the aesthetic, to the mind's spontaneity. The transcendental analytic deals with the active capacity of the mind to organize, unify, and synthesize that data. Understanding's central characteristic is synthesis, bringing together diverse perceptions under a rule.
This active element is where we form concepts. We often think of a concept like dog as just a label we put on similar objects, but Kant sees them as far more robust than that.
They're much more than labels, they're functions of unity. They are rules for unifying the discontinuous raw sensory data we receive. When you unify a series of shifting colors, sounds, and physical sensations under the concept dog, you're not just naming it. You're anticipating its appearance, its behavior, and how it will interact with the world under certain conditions.
And this leads to that famous quote that really encapsulates the entire analytic. Perceptions without concepts are blind.
And the complement to that, thoughts without contents are empty. They emphasize that knowledge requires two components: the empirical content supplied by the senses, which is structured by space and time, and the conceptual structure supplied by the understanding.
Now, most concepts like dog or gold are empirical, but Kant is concerned with the concepts that aren't derived this way, the ones that are necessary for objective experience itself. These are the categories, the pure a priori concepts.
These categories, things like substance, causation, quantity, quality, are the universal tools of thought. They don't distinguish specific differences between things. They stand for the most general principles necessary to think of anything as a unified object. For instance, you can't think of a chair without applying the concept of substance, that the properties are unified in a durable thing, and quantity, that it is one chair, not zero or many.
This is the really complex part of the critique, the deductions. Kant attempts to systematically derive these categories, first through what he calls the metaphysical deduction, connecting them to the purely logical forms of judgment we use in everyday reasoning.
Yes, the metaphysical deduction essentially shows that these categories are the pure intellectual counterparts to the logical acts of judging. But the real philosophical heavy lifting is the transcendental deduction, which asks the profound question: by what right do we apply these pure concepts, which exist solely in the mind, to empirical observations that come from outside?
That sounds like Hume's original challenge, just rephrased. Hume said we have no right to apply causation to the world. Kant is asking, how can we justify the entire application of thought to sense data?
Exactly. And Kant's transcendental deduction demonstrates that these categories are necessary because they are the very principles required to synthesize the manifold of perception into a unified, coherent experience, one that we can deem objective. If we didn't apply these concepts, the world would just remain a flux of subjective, meaningless sensations.
And the outcome of this whole process is the principles of pure understanding, particularly the analogies of experience. These principles, like the permanence of substance or the principle of causality, are not facts proven by science. They are the fundamental grounds of the possibility of experience.
Let's spend some time on the principle of causation, as it's Kant's direct counterpunch to Hume. We need to establish how the mind imposes necessity on succession.
The challenge, as Kant defined it, is distinguishing between succession in our apprehending and apprehension of succession. What does that even mean?
Okay, consider this simple yet profound example. You're sitting in a room and you look at the door, and then you turn your head and you look at the window. Your apprehension, your sensory experience, is successive: first door, then window. But you know that the door and the window coexist. They are simultaneous objects in space.
Right. Now imagine you watch a car drive down the street. You see it in position A, and then position B, and then position C. Your apprehension is successive again. But here you judge that the succession from A to B, is objective. The car actually moved.
The crucial question is, how do you know the difference? If all you ever experience is a flow of successive perceptions, what forces you to judge that the door and window coexist, but the car's movement is objective change? If the world were a dream, every perception might be arbitrary.
And Kant's answer is that we have to assume necessity.
Yes. Objective experience of change is only possible if we assume that the fragmented perceptions we receive are parts of a connected system of reality governed by necessary law. If we thought changes were arbitrary, if the car could suddenly jump from B back to A, or just vanish entirely without a cause, experience would be a mere jumble. We'd have no basis to distinguish between a subjective whim of our attention and an objective event happening in the world.
Therefore, the necessity of assuming causation, that events are determined in time by what precedes them, isn't derived from observing specific causal laws. It comes from the need to make the world consistent and intelligible. It's a rule that we, the observers, have to impose on our perceptions to establish an objective order.
This is a powerful move. It justifies causation as a priori and universal, solving Hume's challenge. But crucially, it also imposes the necessary limitation. Causality is proven valid, but it applies only to phenomena things structured by space and time, things as they appear to us.
So we have certainty about the structure of our experience, but we have to accept that our certainty ends at the limits of possible experience. If we try to take the category of causation outside the realm of phenomena and apply it to things considered apart from how they appear, to the things in themselves,
We will immediately misuse it and fall into philosophical contradictions, which is precisely the subject of the final section of A Critique of Pure Reason, the demonstration of the impotence of speculative reason.
in the transcendental dialectic, Kant turns to the grand traditional problems of metaphysics, the ultimate nature of the soul, the universe, and God. These are the very problems that led to that intellectual weariness and complete indifferentism he wanted to cure. He's showing how metaphysical speculation on objects that transcend experience is impossible as a rigorous science, even if the urge to speculate is an inevitable natural disposition of the mind.
This section diagnoses reason's natural tendency to overreach. Our reason is driven by an ideal of completeness, a desire for the totality of conditions that explain everything. It wants to jump beyond our fragmented, finite experience and speculate on the whole.
And when we attain that jump, when we apply the categories like substance or causation, which are only valid for connecting phenomena beyond their intended range, we immediately run into internal contradictions. And these are the famous antinomies.
The antinomies are sets of contradictory but equally provable conclusions, a thesis and an antithesis. The fact that reason can logically prove two mutually exclusive statements about the same thing proves that the premises used, the categories applied transcendentally, must be invalid. Speculative reason has hit its wall.
Let's look at the first two antinomies, which deal with the universe in terms of space and time.
They express the inadequacy of applying spatial and temporal measurements to reality as a whole. For example, Thesis 1, the world had a definite beginning in time and is spatially finite. Antithesis 1, the world is infinite in time and space.
And Kant argues both are false.
Because we're treating the universe as a thing in itself that can be measured, when space and time are only the forms of our perception, we're trying to measure the whole using tools designed only for the parts that appear to us. The question of whether the noumenal universe is finite or infinite is simply beyond the competence of our categories.
This move clears the deck, showing that rationalist dogmatism about the ultimate nature of the world is just impossible. But the most critical one for his overall system is the third antinomy, freedom versus determination.
This is the existential conflict. Thesis: freedom exists, a causality of self-determination, a capacity to start a series of changes independently. Antithesis: everything takes place entirely according to the laws of nature, meaning everything, including human action, is determined by preceding events. Causation rules all.
And if that antithesis is absolutely true, then the entire structure of human morality, duty, responsibility, praise, blame it all vanishes, because no one could have ever acted otherwise.
Exactly. And this is the moment where Kant uses his phenomenal noumenal distinction to save freedom. Since the category of causation only applies to phenomena, the contradiction is merely apparent. The two statements concern two different realms.
Okay, walk us through that separation.
We view the human being from two necessary standpoints. From the scientific standpoint, as an object in space and time, as a phenomenon, the action, the observable result, must be determined by prior causes. If a scientist observed an action, they would have to trace its causes back to environment, biology, psychology.
But the moral standpoint.
The action is also regarded as the product of the noumenal self, the self as a thing in itself, independent of our perception, operating outside the constraints of phenomenal time. In this nonsensible realm, the will is free and self-determining.
But if I understand this correctly, this only proves the possibility of freedom. It just shows that determinism isn't a necessary truth about the whole universe because it only applies to appearances. How does Kant bridge that gap between possibility and certainty?
That's the crucial tension. Intellectually, from pure reason, we cannot prove freedom. We can only defend its possibility against the deterministic claims of understanding. The fact of freedom, its certainty, cannot be deduced theoretically. It has to be known through something else, specifically, through the undeniable command of the moral law.
Before we get to morality, Kant also applied this same critical scalpel to the traditional intellectual proofs of God's existence. He argues they all ultimately fail because they try to reach a transcending conclusion using categories limited to immanent experience.
His takedown is famous. First, the ontological proof, which tries to define God into existence by claiming that the concept of a perfect being necessarily includes existence. Kant just points out that existence adds nothing to the concept of an object. I can perfectly conceive of $100, but that doesn't put them in my pocket.
Right. Then there's the cosmological proof, which argues that since contingent things exist, a necessary being must exist to cause them.
Kant grants the logical premise. We have to assume a necessary being to explain existence. But he argues it fails to prove that this necessary being is the morally perfect God of religious faith. It's just an abstract intellectual requirement.
And finally, the physico-theological proof, the argument from design, which he actually treats with the most respect.
He recognizes the power of that argument. We certainly see purposeful arrangement in the world, but if we're being honest about our experience, we also have to acknowledge imperfections, failures, and a want of harmony. This proof, based only on phenomenal observation, can only get us to a concept of a very wise, powerful designer, but not necessarily to an infinitely perfect deity.
So the ultimate takeaway of the dialectic is that reason, used speculatively outside the limits of possible experience, is impotent regarding these transcendent objects. We can't know God, freedom, or immortality through intellectual deduction alone.
And the conclusion is powerful. Knowledge in these transcendent areas isn't reached by what we think, but by what we do. Kant is effectively limiting reason to make room for faith. The critique of pure reason ends by handing the baton to the moral life.
So if the first critique was about setting the boundaries and recognizing the limits of theoretical reason, the critique of practical reason is its complement. It's about affirming the absolute sovereignty of reason in the sphere of action and morality.
This moral theory is entirely built upon that premise from the third antinomy, the autonomy of the will, the hypothesis of freedom. The moral law, for Kant, is the only fact that makes us certain of our freedom. He believed that once you assume freedom, morality, together with its principles, follows from it by mere analysis of the conception.
This means we have to make a really rigorous distinction between actions that are driven by external forces or our internal desires and actions driven purely by reason.
We distinguish between heteronymous actions and autonomous actions. Heteronymous actions are governed by inclination, our likes, dislikes, circumstances, environment. When we act according to inclination, we're just subject to cause and effect. We're acting as a part of the natural, phenomenal world.
And this is why in that heteronymous view, we can be sympathetic to people who commit wrongs, because we trace their actions back to poverty or circumstance, and we arrive at that conclusion, tout comprendre, tout pardonner. To understand all is to forgive all.
But moral judgment completely rejects that sympathetic conclusion. Moral judgment appeals to a different standard, what ought to be. This concept of duty demands that we act not as a determined part of the physical world, but as a moral agent, determining our will in accordance with a universal rational law.
Duty, then, is the appeal to the autonomous will, the power in us that cuts across all empirical considerations. By obeying the moral law, the will is self-legislative. It's its own author. And this power of self-determination is moral freedom.
Exactly. If you feel the command of duty, you must be free to obey it or reject it. The command itself is the proof of the fact of freedom. This leads directly to the categorical imperative, the absolute unconditional command that is the foundation of all Kantian ethics.
And it's categorical because it's derived solely from our nature as rational, responsible beings, independent of any desired outcome. It contrasts sharply with the hypothetical imperative.
Right. The hypothetical imperative is conditional. It's always, if you want X, then do Y. If you want to pass the test, you must study. The categorical imperative removes the if. It doesn't say, if you want to be happy, do your duty. It says simply, do your duty, period. Duty and morality have to be absolute.
We need to detail the two most famous formulations of this absolute command, starting with universalizability.
The first formulation states, act only according to that maxim which you can at the same time will to be a universal law. The crucial test is rational consistency. Can you rationally will a world where everyone acts on the same rule you're proposing for yourself?
The classic example here is lying. You can't universalize it. If everyone lied, if the maxim of lying were universalized, the very concept of truth and communication would collapse, and the act of lying itself would become totally ineffective.
Exactly. Lying is philosophically parasitical. It relies on the general rule of truth existing while you make a self-serving exception for yourself. You cannot rationally will the destruction of the system that makes your exception possible. If you can't universalize the maxim, the act is immoral.
And the second formulation grounds this moral obligation in human dignity.
Oh.
Act so that you treat humanity in your person and in the person of everyone else, always as an end as well as a means, never merely as a means.
This is immensely practical. It means we have to recognize the autonomous will, the capacity for rational self-legislation in ourselves and in others as having intrinsic, non-negotiable worth. Every human being is a lawmaker, and therefore, they are an end in themselves.
So if we use someone merely as a means to an end, say, exploiting a worker for profit while neglecting their well-being, we deny their rational agency. We treat them like a tool, a mere means to our goal, not an independent, rational being with their own goals.
This is why the good will is the only thing good without qualification. It's the will that acts purely out of respect for the moral law, independent of external success or natural inclination. That dedication to duty is what gives moral actions their worth and dignity.
But this sharp, almost surgical separation between the moral law and natural feeling leads directly to the primary critique of Kantian ethics, which is often called rigorism. Let me pose a scenario. If I save a drowning child because I happen to love children and the sight of their distress causes me pain, my action is driven by inclination. Is that action fundamentally worthless to Kant compared to someone who hates children but saves them purely out of respect for duty?
That is the common difficulty in interpreting Kant, and it's a profound challenge. Kant certainly suggests that moral value is only truly present when an action is performed out of duty, not from inclination. He sometimes seems to imply that if you enjoy doing the right thing, its moral worth is actually lessened. This is where the critique of the morbid theory of conscience comes from.
It just sounds so cold, so counterintuitive to how we gauge human goodness.
The key is nuance. Kant is not saying that having feelings is bad. He's saying that the source of the moral goodness cannot be those feelings. If you save the child because you love children, well, what if you hated that particular child? Your action would change. A genuinely moral act must be reliable, and its reliability can't hinge on fickle feeling. It has to hinge on the universal law that every life is valuable, and that is a command of duty.
So even if the good person feels pleasure when acting morally, the moral worth comes not from the pleasure, but from the fact that they acted in alignment with a universal law that they rationally legislated for themselves. The inclination might accompany the act, but it can never be the reason for it.
Precisely. The moral standard is derived from the demands of rationality and consistency applied universally, not from happiness or pleasure or any anthropological facts about human nature.
Okay, so having rigorously separated the phenomenal world of mechanistic nature in the first, critique and the noumenal world of absolute moral freedom in the second, Kant recognized he had created this gigantic philosophical gulf. How can a moral free agent act in a deterministic, machine-like world? His third great work was the necessary attempt to bridge that gap.
The critique of judgment is Kant's effort at reconciliation. He needs to find a way to unify the world of nature where everything is determined and mechanistic with the world of freedom, where reason provides the absolute, self-legislative moral law.
Yeah, and he starts by introducing a new mental faculty, the faculty of judgment.
Judgment is the spontaneity of applying universal rules to specific, individual instances. It's kind of like genius or intuition. It can't really be taught. In the first critique, the understanding was always given the rule like causation and told how to apply it. Here, in the third critique, the faculty of judgment has to find the specific rule to categorize the infinite variety of empirical data.
And the scientist investigating empirical laws, say, a chemist finding new relations between elements, must assume some kind of guiding principle beyond the necessary categories we already talked about.
Yes, the scientist must assume that nature is purposive to the understanding. That is, despite the enormous, indefinite variety of empirical laws, the scientist must act as if those laws can ultimately be reduced to some kind of unity, continuity, and intelligibility. The scientist has to assume their job is even possible.
And this assumption leads to Kant's final critical distinction, regulative principles versus constitutive principles.
The categories like causation are constitutive. They are necessary laws that nature must obey for our experience to be possible at all. They constitute our reality.
But the principle of unity or intelligibility is regulative.
Correct. It's a principle that guides, directs, and improves our knowledge, pushing us toward completeness. We don't know for a fact that nature must conform to our desire for simplicity, but we have to act as if it will. This regulates our scientific effort.
Kant then finds the perfect place to explore this idea of purposiveness, the idea that something appears orderly and meaningful even if it has no external purpose. In aesthetics, specifically in the judgment of beauty.
The judgment of beauty is a supreme act of the faculty of judgment because it is simultaneously free and disinterested. It's free because it's not based on a specific predetermined concept, like a scientific measurement,
Mhm.
and it's disinterested because it's irrelevant to any particular personal desire or utility.
So if I see a magnificent painting, my judgment of its beauty isn't rooted in, I want to buy it, or it's historically important. I'm just judging its form in isolation.
Exactly. Beauty consists only in the object's form, its arrangement. This disinterested pleasure is surprisingly universal because it stems from the object's ability to stimulate the proper harmony of our cognitive faculties, the imagination and the understanding, in their free, non-purposive play.
So the beautiful object is purposive to the understanding because its arrangement mirrors the kind of unity the understanding is always seeking in science. It suggests the general principle of intelligibility that guides the scientist.
And this has profound implications for morality. Aesthetic pleasure is disinterested pleasure. It proves that enjoyment and satisfaction are possible without being a slave of our phenomenal nature, without being governed solely by inclination. It gently eases the tension of the second critique by showing that freedom and feeling can coexist.
Furthermore, the experience of the sublime, that overwhelming power of a storm or a vast mountain range, is said to remind us of the impotence of our physical, phenomenal self, while at the same time calling forth the yet greater might of the moral law within us. It reminds us that our true measure isn't in our physical strength, but in our moral rationality.
Finally, Kant applies this framework to the great internal conflict in our understanding of nature, especially in biology. Teleology, which is explanation by purpose, versus mechanism, explanation by necessary cause.
Mechanism explains reality as a determined machine. But organisms, living things, they defy simple mechanism. They're teleological. Their parts exist for the sake of the whole, and the whole exists for the sake of the parts. They aren't just machines.
The scientist insists on mechanism everywhere. The vitalist insists on ultimate purpose everywhere. Kant's final synthesis is the critical resolution. Both mechanism and teleology are only regulative principles of explanation.
So we must scientifically push mechanism as far as it can possibly go to explain the phenomena. We have to try to reduce every biological process to chemistry and physics.
Yes, but when that fails to provide a complete understanding of, say, reproduction or healing, the holistic nature of the organism, we must regulate our investigation by using the concept of teleology, of purposiveness. We treat the organism as if it were purposively designed.
But we must avoid making either principle a constitutive law. We have to avoid converting mechanism into the ultimate theory of the universe, and we have to avoid converting teleology into theological dogma about the universe's ultimate goals. They're both just necessary tools for the scientist applied within their proper sphere.
And this conclusion unifies the three critiques. The limits of theoretical knowledge from the first critique and the necessity of moral freedom from the second are reconciled by the necessary assumptions made by the judgment in the third, as it seeks unity and intelligibility.
This has been an absolutely monumental deep dive into the main principles of Immanuel Kant's philosophy, a system that fundamentally reset the parameters of modern thought. For you, the listener, let's quickly solidify the major takeaways that structure his entire project.
At its foundation, Kant establishes the necessity of criticism, that taking stock of our cognitive powers. This was made necessary by the problem of the certain yet non-analytical synthetic a priori judgments causation geometry, which Hume's skepticism had fatally undermined.
His solution, the Copernican turn, means that the mind structures experience. This places a limit on all knowledge. It is restricted to phenomena things as they appear, organized by the necessary forms of space and time.
And we need the categories, pure concepts like causation and substance, to synthesize these perceptions into an objective, unified experience. But when these categories are used speculatively beyond experience, they lead to inevitable intellectual contradictions, the antinomies.
And to resolve the dilemma of freedom, Kant defends the possibility of freedom through the noumenal self. This freedom is only known for certain through the existence of the moral law, which we obey in the form of the absolute rational command, the categorical imperative.
Finally, the critique of judgment bridges that gulf, showing that our scientific investigation and our ascetic life are guided by regulative principles, the necessary functional assumptions of unity and purposiveness, which are useful for improving knowledge but are not ultimate constitutive laws of the universe.
So what does this entire vast system mean for us today? Kant's philosophy teaches the profound impossibility of absolute knowledge. We can never know the universe as a totality, as the thing in itself. But by accepting those limits, he simultaneously enforces the absolute validity of scientific knowledge and the non-negotiable certainty of moral freedom, but within their proper limits.
And that leaves us with a final provocative thought that really defines the tension in his system. Kant demonstrates that we can never intellectually know the universe as a complete, unified organism because we can never know all its parts or all the relations between them at the same time. This means the critical process, scientific investigation, moral inquiry, aesthetic appreciation must continue indefinitely. We must constantly push back the limits of knowledge, even though those limits can never, by definition, be entirely removed. The journey is the essential work.